I wasn't going to do the schmarmy intro thing, but I just find it amazing that I write random words on the internet and I make GIFs and suddenly I'm in LA talking to all you people. It's ridiculous. So thank you very much, everyone. So I'm Matt Estela, and this is going to be KineFX explained. In coming up with titles for this, my brother and I and a few others workshopped a lot of titles. This was nearly the title, KineFX Chocolate. When I had this list, I couldn't leave them aside, so I peppered them through the talk. So if you see them, enjoy. So here's a bit of a teaser of what I'll be talking about today. So some paper cutout animation, some arty-looking birds, and a drumming jellyfish made out of junk, and they all use KineFX in some capacity. I always get comments on YouTube saying I'm talking too fast. Am I talking too fast? Should I try and slow it down? No? Okay, good. Yeah, they've got speed controls on YouTube these days anyway. Come on, people. So, first thing, 2D rigs in KineFX. The reason I put Brendan's name all over this is this was me helping out my friend Brendan, who's a designer-director. We met a remarkably long time ago, back in about 2002. So he was primarily After Effects, Cinema 4D, and Maya. He was getting a bit frustrated with all those tools, so he started dabbling in Houdini, and I was helping him a little bit here and there. So this is the end results. So it looks very much like sort of an Illustrator, After Effects-y kind of project, but he had done paper cutout style animation using After Effects before, and there's plugins he can get, but he found it really difficult. So he asked me, could we maybe use Houdini for that? This was shortly after KineFX had come out, and I said, maybe. And that was enough. We were off to the races. His first job was he was taking stills from the production and tracing them in Illustrator. He worked out different angles he was going to get. He also found some footage you can see in the tiny list of you there, just people jumping around in front of green screens, which he traced just to get a sense of the kind of motion he would need. To bring those results into Houdini, Brendan was rendering out PNG files per layer and putting them onto cards. We did look into the trace stop, but even that was more than what we needed, so this was fairly simple and easy. The hardest part of it was essentially aligning the pivots of each body part onto the origin, which actually wasn't very hard at all. The skeleton is very much sort of like a flat paper 2D thing, like you'd use in, say, South Park, I guess, with a tiny bit of offset in Z to make sure that the limbs and the body center and the file limb don't fight in Z. The joints are mirrored, derive controls from the rig by splitting off the limbs and then reversing the order so that they can be used for Aka handles, and a bunch of rig poses to actually animate them in space. I did put in a little reverse foot rig, but Brendan didn't need it, so that was taken out. I did plan to wrap it all up as a nice, tidy HDA to get like a single nice top-level control, but we're kind of pressed for time, and Brendan was actually pretty technical and quite happy to dive around the network, so we left it as is. A fun part of KineFX and why I really like it is that because it's in SOPs, you can bring a lot of your SOPs tricks to the table. So because these were rigid pieces, we didn't need skinning, so we could skip that. I did look at using the Capture Pack Geo SOP, which is designed to link rigid shapes onto bones, but that expects the shapes to already be in the right position relative to the joint, whereas we had already put all of our shapes down at the origin. So because of this, I thought, well, I can just use basically a simple copy to points. So as long as the joints share the same name as the texture cards, and if you use the piece attribute toggle, then they would just snap to where they were meant to go in the right orientation. It was quick and lazy. Brendan wanted me to point out that it was really easy for him to set up all the different characters after I did the first one, because he could just swap out textures, do minor adjustments to the skeleton proportions, thank you very much, and even transfer animation and poses between rigs. And he was saying that he remembered trying to do that using After Effects on his previous job. It was really, really hard. So this was all very straightforward. The finished rigs are pretty clean and straightforward, but even, again, Brendan wanted me to point out that to do this level of rigging inside After Effects would be a massive hassle. The actual rig and animation is in the top lower right of the graph. The top part, what looks complicated, that's just breaking out the various cards and putting on textures. So it's just pretty basic controls for arcade controls for the hands and feet and to rotate the hips. Pretty simple. Brendan was already pretty comfortable with the rendering side. So here he just object merged all the characters in, made sure that they were separated slightly in Z, did little minor shader tweaks, pretty fast, responsive. For the characters had to jump from one side of these scales to the other. And again, I used sort of lazy SOP tricks rather than get too deep into KineFX rigging that I was sort of learning on the fly as I was trying to help Brendan. So in the same way that each body part was copied to points onto the joint point, I could then take the entire character and I could copy to points that onto a single point at the base of the scale. I then extracted points for the bottom of the scale, the edge of the scale, the edge of the other scale, and then the bottom of that scale. And I then just blend shaped another point between those points and then copy to points the character onto that thing. So that meant that Brendan could play with the timing of the scale, swinging back and forth, and his animation would just adapt when just need like a tiny amount of tweaking. So lazy, quick. So remember before I said, oh, these pieces are all like packed and rigid, they don't need to deform. I didn't see this coming. So you can see that when she gets off balance and her legs stretch beyond her skirt, luckily this was actually pretty easy to fix. I could just do a local regular skinning just on the skirt. So I could split off the packed skirt, unpack it, subdivide it. I could make a few extra joints for the skirt edge, which because of the way the data flow was going, it would automatically inherit the correct rotations and position of the skirts, skin the skirts to those joints, delta mush it, and merge it back in. So what I thought was going to be a panic, quick change and a huge re-rig was actually straightforward. And Brendan didn't have to change anything in his animation. So that's that part. Any questions about that before moving on to the next thing? Or we can save questions for the end. Questions for the end. Very good. So next was stylized birds. So this was another title sequence that looked like this. This is the finished results. So flat shaded, stylized, reasonable range of motion, multiple birds. Some of them flap their wings, so a bit more ambitious than the previous projects. And again, he asked me for help, and I went, yeah, sure. So off we went. So here's some of the pitch artwork that Brendan gave to both the client and to the modeler, a guy named Chris Harris. The intent was to keep it all very illustrative, more than a photoreal. So as Chris started work on, what on my phone? As Chris started work on the meshes, I was doing some R&D. So this is from the True Bones FBX library. It's a free thing you can get. It's on Gumroad. And I just wanted to check the basic stuff. So loading a mesh and a rig, put a joint to form, and it all kind of works. If you freeze the mesh and then apply a rig pose, then you can pose basic stills, simple enough. What surprised me with this little test was see how low res both the mesh and the rig was, but the motion looked pretty good. So in my head I was thinking, okay, keep it simple and I can probably make it work. So this is playing with some more ideas that I always wanted to try in Maya of just doing some simple procedural keep alive. So I sculpted a blink shape with an edit sop, and I used a wrangle to just make a simple detail attribute, which would just like randomly go between 0 and 1. I used a blend shape that was that had the slider linked to that vex attribute, and I could now just layer on blinks on top of this animation. So that worked pretty well. Extending this a little further, I made another detail attribute in a similar way, again doing sort of random soft changing values between one called beak, and I drove a rig pose rotation on the beak joint with that. If I layered that on top of an idle loop, that all kind of worked. So yeah, progressing well, feeling warm. I knew that there was multiple birds, and I was curious what we could do in terms of getting away with just brute force sculpting on one bird. So I used the topper build SOP to just kind of like roughly hammer this bird into a different shape, apply it as a blend shape, and it kind of worked. You can see just there that the beak was crashing through the upper beak, but I could just append another rig SOP and do a little corrective on that, and it made it look happy, so that was all pretty cool. I noticed though that it was hard to sculpt it at the bind pose when I knew I was hitting this other sort of like idle pose. SideFX very nicely gave me some help with that. So if you add an empty transform matrix to every point, call it, say, at xform, then you joint deform and tell the joint deform to also deform that attribute, the matrix will be modified per point, which is now storing the difference between the bind pose and the animation. Now you can lock that off with the time shifts, and you can topper build in that pose. Then you can copy those positions with an attribute copy back onto the joint deform mesh, and then you use a transform by attribute SOP to inverse the matrix, so that now you have what that would look like if you had sculpted it back at the bind pose. I'll put this tip online. I didn't want to share it yet, so I could talk about it here first and brag. So now you would have the mesh as it would have looked if you had sculpted it back in the bind pose. The results were, yeah, but it's a good trick, one that I've needed a few times in the past, and I found there's actually, I found SideFX shared that there's a fairly straightforward way of doing it, so, and trick. By this stage, Chris was starting to deliver the meshes. So now that I had my R&D out of the way, I started to look at the meshes he was providing. So I did a really simple rig, mirrored it, biharmonic skin, and this time was using a rig wrangle to do some simple random rotation animation on a few joints, including the hips, used an IK chains to lock the feet to the floor, joint deform, and it moved. Wasn't perfect, but you know, it was a start. That's the IK chains. Come on, hurry up. There we are. And so, proof that it was going to kind of work. The heron came next. I was feeling pretty cocky, so I tried the same technique. So I think I even reused the same network, and I just adjusted the skeleton SOP to the new base mesh. Now I knew that for this one, the wings would have to open and close. So I figured that'd be pretty simple to set up. Just, you know, a few more essentially kind of finger joints, skin it all, make a rig pose to basically collapse the wing and the fingers down against the body. Pretty confident I'd get a really nice results. And I looked at the skin and I saw that. I went, man. So I figured if I could decompose the wing fold into two moves, it might help me understand why it was failing. So I had the insight that if I could make sort of the meat of the wing look like, you know, a standard delicious chicken wing, that'd be a start. And then if I could prove that that part looked okay, in fact, I did prove that that part looked okay, but it's when I then separated out the primary feather fold animation that things started to look bad and strange. So I knew that was where I needed to do some work. What I realized I needed to do was I had to rotate the primary feathers individually, but also realized that I'm not a Maya rigger. I'm not going to individually rotate feathers like some common farmer. I needed some cool, smug Houdini procedural solution. So lucky for me, Chris had done a really nice job with modeling the feathers. So they were in a nice named group. They all shared the same UV layout and even shared the same topology. So what I could do was, in a for loop, I could identify each feather island, extract out the center line, isolate the first point of that line, call that roots, extract the last point, call that tip. And now that I've had some clean correspondence, I now had a basis for generating a bone for each feather. So to combine that idea with the full rig, I first had to rename the primary feathers so that they each had some nice unique name, and they had the left to right-hand side indicated with an L or an R. This time, when I ran the for loop, I just kept the roots of the lines, applied a rig doctor to get the transforms, and merged those with the original skeleton. I then parented those new feather joints to the closest skeleton joint. Then to handle skinning, I'd split out the primary feathers, and the rest of the body was all skinned via regular biharmonic. But because I had derived the joints from the mesh, they now share the same name, which meant that whereas in the previous project, I had to do a copy to points to do the matching, here I could use the capture pack geosop because I had exact same matching names all in the exact correct locations. Perfect. So for the animation, I used two rig poses, one for the arm and another for the feather joints. And so in that new rig pose, I would lie the feathers down against the body. That all went into a skeleton blend, so I could control the timing of when the arm folded versus when the wings, versus when the primary feathers would fold back against the body. So I got that all set up. Here's my various rig poses. And I was looking forward to show in this particular screen capture a complete working wing, and then realized that I'd only done the primary feathers and skipped the secondary feathers. And I went, ugh. So just to make sure I had a slide show, that's the entire wing, but with the broken secondaries and a little shake of frustration. But if I hid them, it worked. So I could see that this was going to work. So here's the same process, but now with the secondaries. And I was surprised that all I had to do was just include the secondary feathers right at the top of the chain, and it all just flowed through and worked, which was pretty awesome. So the final test after Brendan reminded me that these wings had to go from a closed to open state. So there's a few intersections, and it's not conforming, beautifully to the body, but I figured this was now a stylized render. We probably won't even see it, so I didn't mention it. So Brendan was working on the material assignments and just general sort of mesh cleanup. He did a pretty good job. So this was the finch, which he gave to me to rig. So he was using the names provided by Chris in his FBX. It was a nice little thing, a nice little example of kind of Houdini being this effort multiplier, which is one of my sort of glib phrases about it. Chris being consistent with his names meant that both Brendan and I could work a lot faster without having to manually select stuff and manually tweak stuff. Just data flowed through, which was really nice. So this is the setup for the finch rig. So because the beak had to be rigid, that was split off and rigged and skinned with a capture pack geo. And then the body without the beak was sent to a regular biharmonic capture. I found weirdly that because of the open mesh, sometimes it would fail. But if I just put a lazy polyfill on it, then the biharmonic worked again, which is great. Because those funny sort of horn crest shapes, they were just purely flat ribbons, and biharmonic didn't like that too much. So they got split off and just used a regular proximity capture, and then merged those horns, the body, and the beak all together. This test animation was the same idea as before, so just rig wrangles, just doing little bits of tiny noise. And then the crest was run through a secondary motion stop that worked pretty well. So by now, Brendan and I were working in parallel across multiple birds, getting a nice workflow happening. So the heron now had a beret, of course. That was capture packed like the feathers, and some extra details like the horns and funny dangly bits off of the beak. The joints went through the random animation things, IK solve. The crest got secondary animation jiggles, and a last rig pose at the end to curl the toes. For some reason, Brendan found that a really amazing solution that we could just throw that in at the last minute and go, oh, that's right, the toes. I didn't think anything of it, but I don't know whether my people in the room would go, ah, my God, the toes can curl. And then Brendan by now saw what the folded wing pose looked like and asked if that could be made any better. I used a taper deformer. So so it's just a simple non-linear deformer to just conform the feathers closer to the body. Bit of a delta mush, because I just couldn't be asked to manually paint weights. That's for losers. Now, that bend on the wings only worked when the wings were closed, so I just used a blend shape that would just mix it in and out as the wings open and shut. So again, simple worked. Now, the frog mouth, needed to be holding a handkerchief like it was Pavarotti. The whole idea of this intro sequence it's based on sort of opera and orchestra and stuff. So the handkerchief was just a grid, vellum drapes, stashed, and then had all its vellum attributes removed. The stash shape I then transformed to sit under the foot, converted it to vellum again, used a vellum attached to geometry constraint to attach it to the foot. Quick solve, merged it with the bird geometry, and it was all good to go. So quick, lazy, fun. The final bird was the fairy wren. So same drill, modify the skeleton to the new proportions, do the primary and secondary feather rig, do jiggle for the bits that need jiggle, a bend/taper for the wing folding, and send it off to Brendan. So that by now, Brendan could just basically bypass my random animation tests and do proper animation. He found it pretty easy just to dive in and add rig poses where he needed, adjust the timings on my skeleton blend to make the wings open and close. he put these together very, very quickly. This is the final animation for the frog mouth. It was really cool to see how the secondary animation really helped with all those odd dangly bits. So that plus the cloth really helped to keep it all kind of alive. And then the finch. So Brendan did some really nice sort of zippy animation, and the secondary stuff worked really well with that. And it's cool to see what Brendan actually animated. So the head animation is just really simple. Then he laid on the hips animation, FBIK for the whole thing, and some secondary motion for the jiggly bit. So, super fast to work. And again, just the final results. So I've worked on a few commercial jobs involving birds in the past and a few films, and I know that both animators and riggers always complain about how miserably hard it is. So the fact that we did 4 birds in a few weeks and it was pain-free, I thought was pretty cool. So could do questions, or we can just save more for the end. Save more for the end. And so next, drumming jellyfish. Gautier. So back in 2007, the Australian artist Gautier had asked Brendan to direct a music video for this song called Heart's a Mess. So that was in 2007. In 2011, this unknown artist, Gautier, released a song called Somebody I Used to Know. I don't know if anyone's heard of that. Seemed to do well, I heard. So then a couple of years ago, Gautier got in touch with Brendan and asked if Brendan could do an extended version of that video from 2007 to use in his live show. So he was going to add a big, long drum solo. So Brendan worked with a designer named Duncan Irving to make this strange jellyfish meets junkyard meets sophonophore, I think it's pronounced, that'd be doing all the drumming. The concept art got refined into some production art, which gave a sense of the kind of complexity we were aiming for. There was a curious challenge here in terms of Brendan was trying to match work he'd done about 15 years ago. So if you made it too simple, like the original video, wouldn't be interesting. If you made it too complex, it wouldn't cut in neatly. So it was a bit of a balancing act there. So this was some of the notes Brendan sent to me, which was broadly what he wanted this thing to do. So it was going to start with the creature sort of coiled up on the surface of the water, drumming away, and then it would then sort of like float up and away. There was lots of layers. He made this other diagram to show me the various layers. It was also going to have to do very specific timing for this drum solo, as well as feel like this slithery, slimy underwater creature. So I had a feeling this would involve both KineFX and vellum. So naturally, the first test was a pig's head test. So using the diagram Brendan gave me as a guide, I created a rigid setup of a pig head, a primary tentacle, and sub-tentacles. I broke this down into primary and secondary vellum sims. So the main tentacle was just a single vellum hair that was just basically constrained to the pig head. And then the secondary tentacles would just track on with that in a secondary sim. Very fast to sim, and it works pretty well. The sim primary tentacle was resampled, was run through a resample stop to have as many points as I needed sub-tentacles. I then took short curves, which I then copied to points onto each of those points, converted those to hair, and simmed. The color for each section was broadly matched to Brendan's diagram, just so we could follow it and track it a bit more easily. So working with really simple geometry, with really low-balled quality, just let me work very quickly to get a sense of gravity and the mass and the drag timings and stuff to see where we had to dial this. Laid some extra arms on top of this. This time I ran those curves through some sweeps just to get a sense of the overall thickness. And then next started to think about how to get these arms to actually drum. So what I did was I grabbed a single tentacle after it had been simulated, ran that to a rig doctor to convert it into a KineFX-friendly chain, extracted the first and last points, then used a rig pose to keyframe the last point to move to those 3 sort of drum placeholders, and then used FBIK to then update the curve to point to there. I could then use a skeleton blend to mix between the vellum animation and my keyframe animation. And then I could sweep the whole thing. And it all worked. This was another early test of trying to get the tentacles to drum in time, but also mixed in with some sort of floppy vellum simulation on top. So I started with a small low-res circle in the center, modified with some noise to look like it was floating on an ocean surface. I copied lines to each vertex of the circle and ran them through a rig doctor to make them into KineFX joint chains. Now to get the timing of the drum solo, I loaded the audio into Houdini and just keyframed 2 points just moving up and down, one for the snare and one for the kick drum. So this was not nice and fast to play with. Those animated values got merged onto a single point. They ran through a trail and a time shift stop so that there were multiple copies of the snare to get that kind of like kind of flam thing. So a flam is when you have when you hit the drum with the 2 sticks slightly delayed to get that sort of like kind of rolling effect. These were fed in as second inputs to a rig wrangle on the arms. And the Y translation of the points that I started with was converted into a local Y rotation on the joints, with each joint getting a small amount of the rotation. So when you added them all up together, it made the tentacles curl up. So 3 tentacles got the kick timing, the rest got the snare timing, all with slight offsets, ran that all through a vellum hair sim, which had some simple placeholder shapes to glide with, and it all worked pretty well. So I got that nice sort of sloppy jellyfish timing. Playing with the vellum settings some more, got this like super sloppy overlap. And this time I was using a chain stop to copy spheres onto each point. If you remember the artwork from earlier, there's going to be like little sort of separated joint chains per thing. And the chain stop let me do that and change the scale without any gaps. So testing a bit further to combine these 2 elements, I now brought in a meshed ocean spectrum node to do the water surface and laid all those elements together. So the drumming tentacles were now copied to points onto a low-res resampled version of the main spline curve. Each layer runs through a vellum sim. They're swept together, and it's all still working. So I was pretty surprised that I could do all these different components, sim them all together, and it all looked cohesive. You can see it all pulling away. Yeah, there we go. Now silly. Even though chops is bad, shouldn't use chops, I had to have a go with chops. So I took the track into Ableton, which is a music audio production software. I had it analyze the audio and try and extract out MIDI data and pull that into chops, and it works. So what I was hoping we could do was that we could ask Gautier if he had the actual original MIDI data from his track, but unfortunately he didn't have it. I then post-justified that by saying, anything sort of directly audio reactive driven tends to look a little bit screensavery, and we probably need more precise control, so it's probably for the best. It also struck me that it might be easier to animate this thing using mocap. So I'd heard of this app called Glycon, where if you have an Oculus Quest 2, you go into it and you see a mirror, and you can press record, and it'll just record your head and your hand positions, and you can export a FBX. So this is me puppeteering the head position using my hands, exported that FBX, pulled that into Houdini. I could extract just the wrist position and the rotation and use that to drive the jellyfish head, which in turn drives the rest of the setup, which I thought was pretty cool. And then I went more stuff. There's also an app for iOS called FaceCap, where you can capture your head and your expressions, and that can also write out an FBX. So this is me again, dancing like an idiot in front of my phone, and using my head position to drive the jellyfish. This is when Brendan said, please stop. I'll just keyframe it. So I put all this aside. The design called for lots of junk and detritus to be tangled up. So Brendan made this amazing library of pieces to play with. So the thick ropes needed barnacles and spikes to be put on it. So that used a scatter and a line with a copy to points to randomize piece selection. And by using an attribute interpolate, it meant that no matter what I did to the rope to twist it up, they all stayed stable, which was pretty handy. larger pieces that'd be underwater, went through some more vellum tests. This was just remeshing it to a lowish resolution, run through a sim with no gravity, high drag, looked nice and floaty. Also tried some of the more high-res shapes with vellum. Brendan had made this net. It didn't work straight off, but it was easy enough to run a fuse and a remesh so that his like fully swept shapes could just be collapsed down to a fairly simple network and vellum that. It's a little bit stretchy, but a few more substeps, it'll work. So vellum's pretty reliable. So this is the full setup that we were going to run through. And at this point, I started to think, oh, this is a lot of stuff. But what I realized, though, is that in terms of, because they were kind of segmented pieces, in actual fact, what I really needed to sim was just that. So I could take essentially the bind pose that Brendan had made, just make a matching curve network and run a sim, and then use those to drive all of those hero meshes, which was largely just using copy to points or chain stops to put all of his little segments onto these curves. Using p-scale on the curves to broadly represent the width of the pieces. Collisions worked pretty well, and it was really fast to sim. One of the other things that was a kind of a accidental handy feature was we were working remotely. So Brendan was in his studio working with his NAS that was mapped to Drive W, and I was working on a laptop. So each time I loaded his setups, I'd have to remap all of his file paths into my location and then change them back to hand the file back to him. Eventually this got very boring. So there's an HScript command called opchange. So I could just type opchange w:/live to $hip/live, and then Houdini would swap every parameter that had that old path to the new path. So then I could change it back on the way out back to him. Later I found an even better way, which is under Windows, there's a command line tool called subst, or substitute, I guess, which lets you set up a virtual drive mapping. So I could make a fake W drive pointing to wherever I'd unzipped all of his assets, and then I didn't have to change Brendan's files at all. So we're both very, very happy with that. So that's probably my one actual practical tip in this whole session. So write that down. The drums themselves will be represented by junk floating in the water. So this is done with my now standard workflow of starting with a low-res circle on the ground plane, ray it onto the ocean spectrum mesh, adding some noise, and then I would copy to points each prop onto the points of the circle. But this needed keyframe controls for Brendan to knock them. And I got to use KineFX again for another unexpectedly cool trick. So this is my other hot tip. So if you use the regular transform stop for that kind of work, it can be annoying to have to keep adjusting the pivot to where you need it to be. But I realized that you can repurpose the rig pose node. So I extracted my circle into points, used a rig doctor to set up some base values, and then applied a rig pose. Now, every time you clicked on a point, you would have the transform gizmo exactly where you needed it. And if you used some orient value beforehand, before the rig doctor, you could even have it be properly oriented exactly the way that you want it to be. So in this case, the local X rotation was always pointing towards the center of the circle. Really handy, really simple, and made him very, very happy. So here we're getting towards the final setup. The core spline is in red, purely dynamic tentacles are in green, the tentacles that are going to hit targets are in yellow, all driven by a combination of keyframes and vellum. You saw before that the bind pose for the entire rig was all perpendicular and flat, but the shot was going to start curled up on the surface. So I ran a pre-roll of about 120 frames, and I just sort of blend shaped the curve to go from straight to coiled, and then ran a vellum pre-sim. And my first pass was too fast, but it actually looked great. It had this like tangled up, janky vibe. So I claimed that as a win. Brendan was starting to do some render tests, trying to match the look of the original video. There we go. And we're starting to get a sense of how complex the final look was going to be. Funny little extra touch was that the spine vertebrae were made up of these little blinking characters, and that was just done using shape replacement in SOPs. Now the hero tentacles, by this stage, they needed to look a little bit more floaty and loose. So we moved the setup to be based on these bouncing primitive spheres. So the keyframe sphere would represent the end of the tentacles, and the tentacle would try and hit that target using vellum. So here's all the pieces that Brendan animated, so it was nice and quick for him to work up. I'd copy the animation from his spheres onto the last points of each curve, and then let vellum try and hit that target using low gravity and high drag. So first it looked broken, and then suddenly you get this rather nice looking silky movement out of it. I felt the motion still looked a little bit too simulated. So I added some extra rig wrangles after the simulation that would randomly curl up the tentacles into spirals, like they were sort of self-aware octopus arms. These had a parameter for each arm, so I could just watch the animation and keyframe the curl in and out each time they weren't hitting a drum. Because this would layer on top of the vellum animation, so there's all my, my parameters there. Because this layered on top of the simulation rather than replace it, it looked really natural and underwatery. Like an idiot, I realized far too late that we couldn't have the entire thing just sit directly on the water surface like it was a piece of carpet. It should be sort of bobbing below the water and above it. And vellum doesn't have a sense of kind of semi-rigid colliders. So I ended up faking it with a wrangle. So in a pop wrangle, the ocean surface was taken out as a collider, but the wrangle would measure the distance to the surface, and I would be basically affecting sort of a fake buoyancy attributes. So you can see that I've got colors on the curve there. So where it was green, they would try to rise. Where it was yellow, they would sink. And I think it was just basically affecting mass per frame, so that just rise and fall and gave a nice and gentle bobbing vibe. So here's all the stages. First, we have the red central spine that has the first point parented to the jellyfish head. It's doing its soft collide with the water surface. The yellow arms are copied to points onto that curve, and they're simmed to follow Brendan's drumming animation. And then finally, the green tentacles are copied onto the spine and are also simmed. For rendering, Brendan asked how to get an interaction pass. That was a simple solver solve. So the ocean surface was made black, the character was made white, and in a solver, I just transferred color and faded it down by 0.9 on each frame. And next is the finished clip, which is a little exclusive. We asked Gautier if we could show it, and he very nicely said yes. So in return, when he tours, you've all got to agree to buy tickets and see it, and give a little cheer for Brendan and I when you see it. Here we go. So the time lapse is shot off of a beach in Sydney called Bronte, where I grew up, which is kind of nice. It was all rendered in Redshift, I think. Gautier was remarkably chill with the entire thing. He just like every time we showed him, he was like, "Yeah, that's right." The tornado is entirely Brendan's doing. I think I've kind of showed him enough tricks that I'm now out of a consultancy job. He's actually really good now. And then that's the little sort of transition to the original piece. So there we are. There's that. So how are we doing for time? Oh. So much like Rich, I also have bonus questions or questions. Bonus? Bonus. Okay. So the reason that these are bonuses is that these aren't KineFX based, but they're still kind of fun. I'm going to do some worms. And I think every time I've spoken at one of these, I always reference something that I learned from Lego Batman or from Lego, largely from that guy over there, Matt Ebb. Thank you, Matt. There's a little cutaway shot in the drum solo where we needed cartoony worms to be writhing over a cartoon corpse, and then they wriggle away, revealing a skeleton. Usual thing. Here's how that works. Like I said, this was reusing tricks from Lego Batman. So I scattered some points over a smooth version of the skeleton and coffin. I then duplicated those points and pushed them away. And then I joined up the matching pairs to make paths. Those paths got rayed back on the ground. And then I added extra noise using the hair and groom tools. It's actually great for doing procedural curve fiddling. And then use an attribute interpolate to move a point down those paths. So there you see them dancing away. I then took, there we are, yeah. I then took a straight line, and that was copied onto each of those points. I then added a sine wave onto the lines, and then I converted the lines into hair, which would all be attached to the points where they were sort of birthed from, and then vellum simmed the whole thing. So there was some sort of like match shape constraint or something which would try to match the sine wave target. So the combination of them being dragged through space, trying to match the sine wave and colliding against the ground, I got this sort of gross wiggly worm thing with relatively little effort, which looks like this, which is pretty gross. So that's bonus tip 1. On bonus tip 2? Yeah, you do. Okay. So musical notes. So you saw in the bird thing, when the birds sing, they then they have musical notes extending out of their beaks, which looks like this. So it's a musical stave that spirals up and away from the birds. The end of the stave kind of falls apart, and the musical notes can fly off of the end of the staves. So I've got a note to say speak faster. Here we go. So a lab's helix node was used to create the initial shape, and I use a resample node just to create a curve view attribute down the curve. This in turn used to drive the stretch stiffness and mask using various ramps. The line is duplicated 4 times up from the stave, and that's converted into vellum hair that uses the stretch stiffness attributes, which is mostly rigid, but just for the last quarter of it is told to relax so that they can flip apart. An animated attribute noise with low frequency animates the lines around, which is controlled also by the same mask attributes, so that the staves near the start don't move, but towards the end get quite floppy. When this is all fed into vellum, you get a nice sort of flowy, floppy kind of thing. I then delete all the attributes, and I now get this ready for a pop sim. So the notes need to stay aligned to the stave. So in order to give myself sort of a stable transformation matrix, I use the first and the last line of the stave, and that becomes my up, and the normal down the curve is my normal. I just grab the start section of the curve, and that becomes where I'm going to emit, and I feed that all into pops. Inside the sim is a small amount of points are emitted from all the lines, and then once a second I emit a single point from the bottom line, and that's called bar. So they've all got name attributes. That one's called bar, the rest are just called various notes. The particles look up the closest location from the curves within a very small threshold. I had stored V attributes on the curve, which is basically the normal, and these particles inherit that V and they push themselves in that direction. If they don't get a min-poles result within that threshold, then that means they've basically fallen off the end of the curve and they just keep flying away. So after the pop sim, another attribute noise, but this time using the discrete mode, which you can see over there, so I can give them random names. So it's like sort of like a quaver, quarter note, whole note. So the tiny bit of music theory that I remembered from high school came in here. So I knew that notes towards the bottom should have lines that point up, and ones towards the top should have lines that point down. So I made a library of shapes that do that. And because I knew which line they were emitting from, I could then say, I could give them random attributes, random name attributes to say, emit these shapes that point up and other ones that point down. And then every bar, I would emit a single bar line, which would also track as well. And then the last trick was Henry Foster's standard rest clip trick. He claims not credit, but I'm always going to credit him for that because he taught me it. And then I merged those clipped shapes, the clipped staves with the notes, and that's the setup. And that's my talk. Hey! Any questions?
Any questions at the back?
Hey, thanks very much for this, and thank you for the Joy FX. It's been really fantastic. So I'm wondering what a good entry point to KineFX might be for like a low IQ generalist like myself. Something that sort of gets you there from the ground up.
Yeah. There's quite a few resources now. So I put a few notes on my site, which were very much from kind of, I'm a impatient, time-starved Houdini person, but this seems interesting. There was a talk at the previous HIVE, the Paris HIVE, where they did a fantastic talk just as I was putting the finishing touches on my thing. I went, oh, God damn it, he's stolen all thunder. But that talk's well worth watching. It's really good. It's about making flowers. And he talks it through from absolute first principles.
Ah, excellent.
It depends on your angle, though, because a lot of the stuff that I do, it's about, I've wanted to do kind of, hierarchy-based point stuff for a while. And I did work it out once, but it was big, ugly for loops and vex statements, and suddenly that all just went away with KineFX. So that was my angle. If you want to do the character-based stuff, there are a few other resources around, like Peter Carr, I think, has touched it a little bit. He'll probably be here and saying, no, it wasn't me. There are a few other YouTube folk doing it, but there's a couple of pre-KineFX things ready to go inside. So if you pull up the Paul Test Studio, that's now been replaced with the KineFX ready thing just to play with and break. But it's way less scary than you think it's going to be. It's basically points plus plus. So it's fun. Just dive in and play. It's good.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Other questions? Yeah.
Oh, there's a mic coming.
What's the best workflow for doing like a fully rigid rig? Like captured packed or like copy to points or?
Yeah, so I think I was glad that I found out the best use case for both. So if you're kind of coming from a copy to pointsy workflow and you're used to that where you have a library of shapes at the origin and you want to put it somewhere, then copy to points with the piece attribute works.
Okay.
But if you've got all your shapes already in place to form the character and you're kind of drawing a skeleton to match, that's what the capture pack geo is for.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. I'll take carpentry questions as well if anyone has.
Could you talk about the flat shading in the animation work that you
I could talk about it. I'll be making it up though because it wasn't me. That was Brendan's stuff. I remember he found it tricky was the thing. Yeah, I think it might have been Octane, I think, and he found Octane fought him to get that sort of non-photorealistic look. But he might have also done a lot of After Effects post-processing because he's really good at that side of it. So sorry.
Other questions?
Hey, so on the first one you showed with the flat people, I was wondering, it seemed almost like you had a bit of dynamic parenting between the two balancing scales as people were going from one scale to the next one.
Yeah.
I think you went over it, but it flew by me.
Yeah. So the idea there was that in the same way that the weird breakthrough for me years ago, which I think I did get from Matt, was I'd always kind of got used to, copy to points is for copying, one thing to lots of things, trees, rocks, stuff. And then at one point I was trying to put something at this specific location and I was struggling with the maths, and I think Matt just walked by and said, you can just copy one thing to one point. That's okay. I went, oh my God, you can totally use one point. That's amazing. And so that's what that is. So it was just, I could extract 1 point from the scale. And so that was after Brendan had animated it. So that point, even though it's been split off from the main shape, it will just move and follow whatever animation he does. And then I could then just copy to points the full character onto that point. But then the next level from there was that, well, I could extract a point at the base of the scale, at the edge of the scale, at the edge of the other scale, and the bottom of that scale, and then just basically blend shape the point between those locations. So it hangs there, and it goes zip, and then it goes zip, and then it goes zip. And the character will then just do that. And all Brendan had to do was just basically animate a single jump animation and it all flowed through.
Nice, thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
Oh, not this guy.
What do you think is better, KineFX or Vellum?
Spicy question, Chris. Look, they're both unique and special in their own special ways, Chris. I can never choose.
I think you said at one point you try to avoid like manual weight painting, which I understand. Is there any way, like if you have weights that are generated that aren't great, to kind of like modify them or make them better without having to go in super manually, like a more procedural way of doing that?
So I've been looking at this newish feature, which is kind of hooks into the capture pack geo stuff, where something that I always loved about the Raf Anzovin setup machine thing, where the workflow for that was that you would have sort of a proxy character made up of tubes and things, and you would sort of conform the tubes over your character, and he was using the tubes themselves to do the weighting. And I thought, man, it'd be great to have that inside KineFX. We now have it. So you can parent whatever shapes you want onto your rig, and you can say, rather than being like sort of, like you're moving rigid shapes or using them for handles, you can say these shapes are to help guide the skinning. I haven't used it yet, but this is exactly what I've been sort of wanting for a while. So that'd be my next thing, because I just hate weight painting.
Cool. Thank you.
Other questions?
10 minutes.
Going once? Going twice? Okay, well, thank you very much, Matt.
Hey.